only a few of our working group members that are on right now, but hopefully, should we give it a minute or two to see if we get more folks? Whitney, what do you think?
Worthwhile.
Well,
Give a couple minutes.
It is 2 o'clock, but I will just give a brief disclaimer. So I think everyone is muted right now except for the few of us that are going to be talking and presenting, but we had discussed that we really want this to be more of a conversation instead of just a presentation to all of you. And so I think once we get started in earnest, we're going to take you all off mute with the expectation that you will mute yourselves until you have a need or desire to chime in. And definitely throughout this webinar, I would welcome any of you to speak up and with questions or comments or concerns or anything like that as we go along, especially if we're going to have a small group. And we are going to record this. I know there are a few people that couldn't make it that want to hear the recording, and so that will be distributed. But I hope that those of you that are on in real time will be able to kind of give us some feedback on some of our resources and engage in more of a conversation as we go along. And we might pose some direct questions to you as well. So I think we should probably go ahead and get started. I'm going to turn it over to Ann Moorkill. She is the working group chair and is the, oh, I hope I don't get your title wrong, the manager of the SF Bay Refuge Complex. Oh, it's such a long title, with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So you might have to correct my butchered title there. But she's going to kind of start us off, and then you'll hear from me again, and we'll work through some of the planning resources that we have been putting together for the group over the summer. And a few more people have joined, so I'll just remind everyone we're about to take you all off of mute because we want this to be more of a conversation, but please mute yourselves until you're ready to chime in with any questions or comments, which you're free to do throughout the webinar.
And kind of as a tag onto that, Sarah, if you are using the voice function on your computer rather than a telephone, if you have headphones with speakers that you can use, that would be great. Otherwise, we get some feedback. You can also switch to listen to the webinar by using your telephone. There's a panel on your right-hand side of the screen. If you go to the audio tab, there will be a phone number that you can dial in and listen that way.
Okay, great. Thanks, Whitney. And so we'll turn it over to Ann.
Okay, hello. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah, I think so, Ann.
Okay, good. Hi, everyone. As Sarah mentioned, my name's Ann Moorkill, and you're correct. I manage the San Francisco Bay National Wildlife Refuge Complex, which has 7 refuges, and in particular for this exercise, includes the Farallon National Wildlife Refuge, which is in the center of the Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary, and I serve as a government representative on the Sanctuary Advisory Council. So I'm kind of the sanctuary, or SAC as we call it ourselves, representative on the working group. So just to bring everybody up to speed, this working group has met twice in person in the spring, and in between those meetings and even since then, there have been some webinars and quite a few conference calls, and that's to engage the members. I'm not sure if that's the slide you've got up yet. We've got membership from federal, state, and local agencies, primarily, landowner agencies, as well as a number of non-governmental organizations and academia that have subject matter expertise in both climate change and climate smart adaptation, as well as the resources on the ground. And just to review again, the goal for the Climate Smart Adaptation Working Group is to develop and prioritize climate smart adaptation management recommendations that can be feasibly implemented by managers within the sanctuary's boundaries, and to reduce the vulnerability of select focal resources while considering a range of plausible future climate scenarios. So the process has been to develop what this range of plausible future scenarios are, and we've focused on 3 habitat types: beaches and dunes as one, rocky intertidal as the second, and estuaries as the third. And throughout this process, if you've either been at the meetings and not on the calls, or not been in the meetings but have been on the calls, that's because we've expanded our partnerships with additional team members, and I think Sarah will go into that in greater detail. So yeah, we had the meeting in April and May, and lots of planning calls, and I apologize because I'm not on the webinar, so I'm not sure which slide we're on. But I do want to focus on working group resources. There's a lot of material that's available to bring folks up to speed and to follow up on this webinar to support the information that Sarah and her team are going to go into in greater detail. So welcome, and I look forward to continue working with you.
Great, thank you so much, Anne. And Anne is joining us kind of from a conference or a class, so thank you for kind of making it happen, calling in with spotty cell reception.
Sure.
And I'll just remind everyone that you're all unmuted right now, well, for the duration of the webinar, but if you could mute yourselves until you're ready to chime in with a comment or question, which you're welcome to do throughout the webinar, that'll just cut down on kind of the background noise. And so just to cover, because Anne doesn't have access to the slides right now, to cover a couple things, I just wanted to review, really the purpose of this webinar is to review kind of what the working group has accomplished thus far and what project staff have been doing over the summer, but really primarily to discuss the process and the timeline for the rest of this working group's meetings, and to review the resources that we've been putting together that we want all of you to be using moving forward. And a lot of these resources are kind of in working draft stages. They're definitely workable and usable, but we do want some feedback from all of you as to how we might be able to improve those in advance of the September 15 meeting, or if not by then, in advance of your October meeting. And so we'll go through all of those resources and have time for feedback and questions from all of you. Anne covered that pretty well, our membership and our goal. And then I know many of you have not been able to be have not been at the meetings because you've kind of recent recruits to the working group, and that's just because at these first 2 meetings we were able to identify kind of gaps in expertise that we really needed to make this group effective. And so I welcome those new members, and I'm glad you've been able to join us. At our April meeting, the group underwent a scenario planning exercise and developed 4 climate scenarios that we'll be hearing about from Sam with Point Blue Conservation Science. He's been leading our scenario planning portion of this working group. And also at that time, as Anne mentioned, the group selected those 3 final habitats to be the focus of their adaptation planning. At the May meeting, working group members were actually working within those habitat planning groups to develop management goals for those habitats. And at that time, we also finalized the scenarios that we were going to be operating within for your future planning efforts. The group did decide to kind of go on summer hiatus and reconvene in the fall. And so since that time, the staff to the working group have really been working to pull together these resources that we'll go over. But also I was able to hold calls with the habitat planning groups to kind of get each group together over the phone, since we had many new members, and to either review and finalize those management goals or to develop those management goals. One of the groups was kind of a newly created group. And so we'll review those management goals as well on this webinar. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to go to what will be your most important resource throughout this process, which is the web page that we have set up for this working group. And here's the URL. I will definitely, send it out to the group again, but it's the same URL we've been using since this group was created. So let me actually get out of the PowerPoint. navigate over to the web page. So here's the web page, and it's hosted by EcoAdapt, which is one of our project planning organizing partners. And you'll see we have an overview for the project. All of the information towards the top of the page here has to do with the next upcoming meeting. And then as you scroll down, you'll see information from all of the past meetings. So here's everything from the May 27th meeting and everything from the April 22nd meeting. Both have been in Oakland. And then beyond that, we have overall resources for the working group as a whole, kind of throughout this project. And really the biggest product from this Climate Smart Adaptation project thus far, which occurred prior to this working group coming together, is the Vulnerability Assessment Report. And this is really the foundation for our adaptation planning efforts. And this is the information that this group actually used to decide on those three, to decide to focus their planning efforts on those three most vulnerable habitats that were identified in this report. So if you haven't already, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the report. Definitely take a look at that just so that you can see what we have accomplished prior to this working group coming together. So I'm going to scroll back up to the top, and you'll see the details for the next meeting that, again, will be at the same building that we've had the past two meetings in Oakland. Let me go ahead and maybe just briefly review kind of our working group participants, but this is here on the web page if you want to find it. We have it organized by our federal partners, state, NGO, academia, and then you'll see all of the staff to the working group here as well. So this is a good resource if you need to get in touch with any particular person. You can use this. And I've also indicated here which planning group each participant is kind of been working in. So let me back out of that. So somebody is not muted, and it's just a little bit noisy occasionally. And so I don't know who that might be, but if everyone could check that they are on mute, then that would be helpful. And so the next thing that I wanted to go over with the group is this roadmap that I've put together. And this is really my way of conveying to the group kind of how we hope this process to go. It also has a timeline for the process, so if at any point you're feeling a little bit lost in, where are we in the whole working group process, what's coming up next, this is a good resource. And so I would ask everyone to kind of become familiar with this. At the top we have, and this also mirrors the web page, the required readings and the supplemental readings, but we have them up here for your reference again. And I will be going through each of these required reading resources so you can see what they are, but we definitely want you to be familiar with those in advance of the September 15 meeting. And then we get into the details for kind of our strategy, our approach to accomplishing the goal of this working group, which is to produce management recommendations for a variety of agencies in the region to take in order to hopefully reduce the vulnerability of our coastal resources. And so, as I've mentioned, the structure of the planning group is really based on these three habitats that were chosen by this group to be the focus of adaptation planning. And so within each of these habitats is where you'll be developing your management recommendations. And so each of you are kind of assigned into one of these habitats, and hopefully have been participating on the calls over the summer to develop management goals for those habitats. Here is some information on how we would like you within your group to organize your recommendations, and this will be reflected on the worksheet that you'll be using at the actual meeting. But this just gives a little more information. These recommendations will basically be developed for each of the 4 climate scenarios within your habitat. And so you'll start on one scenario develop recommendations for that scenario, and then move on to the second climate scenario. And we'll review those scenarios a little bit later on this webinar. And so some of the items that we want to be included in your management recommendations include a time horizon, and this group decided that we didn't want it to be too specific, that we preferred kind of short-term strategies versus long-term strategies. Also, what is the major impact that this strategy is addressing, and what are the implications of that impact? For example, sea level rise and wave action that may lead to enhanced erosion, habitat loss, or road damage. Whatever particular strategy that's being proposed here is being proposed in order to deal with these impacts. Additionally, information on spatial detail of the strategy, if the strategy is applicable kind of very generally across the whole range, or if it's developed for a specific location. For example, Bolinas Lagoon. We do expect that the estuaries group, for example, will be developing recommendations specific for Bolinas Lagoon. Another location that has come up is the Fitzgerald Marine Reserve as a specific rocky intertidal location that we may have recommendations developed for. And so really we're looking at recommendations that kind of span the breadth of detail. Some will be very detailed and applicable only for a specific location. Some we expect may be a recommendation for a suite of recommendations for managers to consider for their particular area, but depending on the characteristics of that area, may or may not be relevant. Additionally, we want you to identify a lead agency for each strategy and required resources that would be necessary to implement that strategy. And then finally, and this is really kind of looking forward and also looking across habitats, to identify any potential interactions you would foresee with other habitat types for any given recommendation. This could be potential conflict with another habitat, how one strategy may negatively or positively impact another habitat, required cooperation across habitat types, or anything else that comes to your attention that may be important to discuss with one of the other habitat planning teams. And so this is just a very basic schematic of kind of how we're approaching adaptation planning. Each of these habitats is a planning group, and you'll be developing recommendations for each of the 4 scenarios for that particular habitat type. We'll end up with strategies for each type, and then what we plan on doing is kind of looking at those strategies to identify any commonalities, any strategies that may benefit multiple habitats, or just common strategies across 2 or more of those habitats. So that kind of covers how we want your recommendations to be organized. And then as far as how they're structured, and again, this is reflected in the worksheet that you'll be working through, we want the recommendations to be consistent, of course, across the planning groups. But we're looking for kind of the overall approach. What's the general idea of this strategy? For example, you're looking to reduce recreational impacts. And then strategic actions that can accomplish that approach. For example, educating the public to reduce visitation, impact through signage, closure zones, increased outreach and enforcement, etc. And then finally, a rationale for that approach. How does this accomplish your management goal? And how does it help to reduce the vulnerabilities that have been identified for that particular habitat? So we want to be able to justify why certain strategies were proposed. I think, Whitney, if you muted everyone, which it sounds like maybe you did, now might be a good time to unmute everyone, because it might be a nice spot. If anyone has questions or comments or ideas of, maybe another detail that we want included before I kind of get to the timeline part of our process.
Yeah, so at this point, everyone should be unmuted or have manual control. So go ahead and unmute yourself and feel free to chime in if you have any questions or comments.
This is Jim
Okay.
Wygand. I wanted to let you know that my colleague David Ledig and I will not be able to be at the September 15th meeting,
Okay.
perhaps because we have oil spill meetings with regard to Refugio Beach in Los Angeles at that time.
Right.
We'll try to be there, um, but it's dicey right now with our schedule. So if there's
Okay.
something that we can do to help you guys in advance, just let us know.
Okay, perfect. Thanks for letting me know. Yeah, I know that
Sure.
that ongoing saga down south has taken up a lot of your time.
Yeah.
And I think we do have another conflict on the working group as well, and so I plan on kind of really critically thinking about if there's any work to be done in advance. Likely there will be more input that I'll want from you after this initial meeting to maybe review what your habitat planning group came up with at this meeting, and to provide anything that maybe you feel like they missed, or to provide edits to that would probably be the likely task that I would look for.
Okay, thanks.
But yeah, thank you for letting me know. So unless there are any other questions kind of on this portion, and
We
of
have
course,
2 questions that people have typed in.
oh, cool.
So the first is from Jack, and he says, great outline. What do you expect of the group regarding involving other resource managers outside of our working group? For example, you mentioned specific recommendations for Bolinas Lagoon. As you well know, there is an existing working group on this. So.
Yeah, so we have tried where possible to actually have those people at the table, and we do have Kate Bimrose, who is the sanctuary's kind of project manager for Bolinas Lagoon restoration activities, on the working group, and she's one of those new additions that we identified because we did realize that Bolinas would likely be a big part of these recommendations. And so we're hoping her role will really be to kind of represent those interests, and I would implore every member of this working group to come to the meetings with your agency's interests, known and kind of at heart and able to share those, but also any partners that you are working with that maybe are not a part of this working group, or any other interests that you know of that maybe are not covered by this working group, to do your best to represent those interests and to represent your agency, because we really are relying on each of you to come to the table with ideas, with our information on ongoing projects that can inform this process. And I do think this will be an iterative process. And so we'll probably come up with, a first set of recommendations at this September meeting. You'll see in our timeline in a little bit, we'll have time to review those, provide input, and at that time, if someone was not at the table, like BLM won't be at the September meeting, that's when we'll really, it will be critical to get input from some of those partners. So I hope that answered your question, Jack.
Great. And then 2 other questions. The first is, what time is the meeting on the 15th?
What time? So we are going to review the agenda shortly, but I can tell you right now, as I pull the agenda up, I think I had it start at 9:30. So there's a lot to get done, and I know traffic in and out of Oakland is not ideal. Luckily, a lot of you ended up doing public transit, which is really fantastic. But this is kind of the latest we can possibly start to be able to get things done. So 9:30 to 4:15 is what we're looking at, but this is still a draft agenda, and so the times could change, but plan on 9:30.
Great. Okay, and then one other question, which is the Pescadero Marsh included in the scope of the study?
It is, yes, and we did bring on Joanne Kerbivaz with State Parks to hopefully represent the interests of Pescadero Marsh.
Great, that's all we have as far as written comments.
Okay, cool. So unless there's anything else, I'll go ahead and kind of get into the timeline process so you can see where we've been and where we're headed. And so we've mentioned the previous meetings that the working group had, and those were very informative and has helped us to refine the working group participation or the membership. And so over the summer, the staff and the working group chair have been producing the resources that are outlined at the beginning of this document, and that we'll be reviewing shortly. And then here's the bullet about what we're doing right now, this informational webinar, to really prepare everyone for your first meeting. And so September 15th is your first official adaptation planning meeting, and the goal is to develop recommendations in each of those habitat planning groups for all 4 scenarios. I think we will know by the end of that day how much, if we budgeted enough time to develop recommendations for all 4 scenarios, or if groups were not able to get through that. And so at the end of the September meeting, we'll kind of refine this timeline and confirm the future meeting dates, as well as the advisory council meeting that you'll be kind of producing your recommendations for. It all depends on kind of how well the September meeting goes and how much is done. Between the September meeting and October 6th is when staff will immediately compile all of those recommendations within Habitats. And the idea is for Anne and myself, or one of us, if only one of us is available, to hold review calls with each planning group. So each habitat group to get on the phone together during this time period and to review all of the recommendations, not just the recommendations in your habitat, but to take comments from each group in order to finalize your recommendations for your habitat, as well as to review other habitats and provide comments on those, and also to help us identify commonalities across habitats, examine whether certain strategies benefit or negatively affect other habitats, and find opportunities for leveraging resources for multiple benefits. So it's really just a time for us to take stock of what was done at the September meeting and to provide time for everyone to be able to look at the other habitats recommendations and provide comments on those. Then working group staff will produce an organized, comprehensive, and compiled list of all of those recommendations that we'll circulate in advance of the October meeting. And then the goal of the October 16th meeting is you'll have this final list of recommendations, and we want to prioritize those. And so we kind of have a method that we plan on doing this to produce a prioritized list of recommendations. And the first step is really to kind of do a first pass at those recommendations, and this is probably going to be based on a lot of the comments from the phone calls, but to potentially remove actions that seem like they're either not feasible or they have unacceptable consequences for other habitats or for other resources. Then with that final list, we want to do kind of a more detailed analysis using a criterion table that enables participants to score each action for each criterion. And so at that meeting, we hope to decide on the final recommendations that will be presented to the advisory council and to decide on what kind of document we want to provide. It could be just a bulleted list of those final actions with, all the details included, or a more formal report. It's really up to the group and how much time we have to put something together. And I did put a note here that we don't have, a limit on the final number of recommendations. We're not trying to come to a list of 5 or a list of 10. It's really up to this group what ends up being produced, how many you put forward, and how you want your recommendations to be available. And so we have a couple ideas, but I think it's one of those conversations that we can't have until you actually start producing recommendations and we see kind of what the products are looking like. And then this last point, I don't think this group will get to, and it might not be the appropriate time to kind of answer this question. But the idea is, for some of these management actions, it would be really helpful to develop a list of questions that particular management agencies could ask themselves in order to assess the feasibility of each strategy for their particular area. Again, that's kind of a whole nother project in and of itself, but it would be a really useful component for some of these strategies that are more general across the region to have maybe a little bit of guidance there. something to keep in mind as we move forward. And so after that October 16 meeting, we have a little bit of time to kind of do some final review of those recommendations. And we've set aside time on October 29th in case we need it to have a final call with all of the working group together. If there's any loose ends or any kinks that need to be worked out, this would be the time to do it. Because November 6th would be the final day we'd be able to circulate those recommendations with the advisory council in order for them to put those recommendations to a vote. They need any material they're voting on 2 weeks in advance. So that would be our target day to have those recommendations circulated. And then at the actual meeting on November 18th, and the working group chair, so a member of the advisory council, she would be actually be presenting these recommendations to the council and asking them to vote on forwarding those recommendations to Maria, the sanctuary superintendent. And I do want to point out this is kind of our internal sanctuary process, but a big component of this project is to produce recommendations that aren't necessarily just useful to the sanctuary. There will be some recommendations that aren't applicable for sanctuary management and are more meant for maybe the Coastal Commission or the Fisheries Service. And so we don't want this group to be bound by what the sanctuary can do. And so I want to make sure that's very clear. Maria will only accept the recommendations that she, as a sanctuary manager, can potentially implement. But we want this group to produce and to be thinking outside of those possibilities. And that's why we have so many different management agencies at the table. I did mention, you know, if we're not able to get through this timeline kind of in this manner, then we do have a possible, you know, alternative schedule. If the recommendations are not complete by November 6th for distribution to the council, we'll unfortunately have to wait until their February meeting. They take quite a break kind of over that holiday season. And so in that case, we would probably schedule a third meeting for this group in November or December to finish up those recommendations and then circulate those for the council for their February meeting instead of the November meeting. And then finally, this document just has a few things to consider when you're preparing for, you know, really brainstorming these potential management actions. There's kind of different categories of actions, and if maybe the group is feeling stuck or you feel like you keep suggesting the same things, this might be helpful to kind of go to these different categories to maybe help get your brain moving. We, of course, want you to be as creative as possible, to be innovative and bold. We have a resource that Whitney will be discussing that really lays out pretty much all the adaptation strategies that have been attempted for coastal and marine environments, kind of as a jump starter and for you to see what's been done. But we really would ask that you even think outside of those strategies, because now's the time to suggest some wild and crazy things, and they may be thrown out, or they may end up being something that the group finds to be a really great idea. And then another pointer on, and also to consider, are your actions going to effectively reduce vulnerability? Because that is really the main goal. We've identified vulnerabilities in our vulnerability assessment, and now we want to reduce those vulnerabilities. So that's kind of that one thing that you should always go back to. Once you're kind of down the rabbit hole of adaptation planning, I think it's good to come back to that and ask yourselves, are we still, you know, putting forth recommendations that will hopefully reduce vulnerability of these resources? And then kind of a question that's been posed a couple times by some of you is, how do we move from an understanding of vulnerability to the actual development of adaptation actions? Because that is kind of a difficult jump to make. And I hope the resources that we've put together will be helpful. But these are a few, you know, pointers to maybe get you started in the habitat vulnerability assessments. That will be a great resource for you. There is a section at the bottom of just some very initial ideas that our assessment participants provided for potential management actions to take. Also, the issue statement that you develop for your group and the identified key vulnerabilities. should be helpful to help you target actions to address one of those 3 components of vulnerability. And then finally, that strategies table that I mentioned that Whitney's going to go over, that's really a springboard to help you think about the possibilities. So that was a long one, but that really is kind of the document that I hope is kind of the all-encompassing document. It goes through the process, it goes through the timeline, and it lays out all the resources that are at your disposal. And so that is a good one to go back to and to maybe go over, you know, the night before our September 15th meeting to just kind of jog your memory about exactly what we're doing. Unless there are questions on that, we can go ahead and look at the agenda for the September 15th meeting. And, you know, a lot of this we've kind of discussed, but I can give you an idea of kind of how we hope the meeting will go and the proposed times. And so I mentioned that we're planning on starting at 9:30.
Really quickly, Sarah, before we get into this, there are a couple.
Oh, yeah. Oh, sorry, I should have asked you, Whitney, first. Okay, go ahead.
Oh, no, it's all right. So the first is more of a comment, and it's looking at, in developing, this is from Marlene. So when we're developing adaptations and management recommendations, just to please keep in mind about what the current management parameters are that are maybe currently being implemented, and make sure to include things such as enforcement. Take those kind of things into account when determining where management actions are suggested.
Okay.
And this is Laura. That's actually a great point, in that one of the things we should flag in creating these strategies are the places where current mandate may be insufficient, or the current mandate may need to be revisited if in fact it has an assumption or an expectation that's unmaintainable or unattainable.
Okay, great. And are these comments kind of saved, Whitney, on the webinar? Are they kind of like, will we have access to that text exactly?
I believe so, but I can also copy them down while we continue on.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. And then another question was, in addition to the prerequisite reading and supplemental readings, is there anything that you suggest that folks do in preparations for the meeting? So, for example, should they think up and suggest their own recommendations prior to the next meeting based on the categories we've discussed previously?
I think if you have some ideas come to mind, it would be very helpful to kind of jot those down. But honestly, with only 2 weeks before the meeting, I feel like I'm asking you all to do a lot as it is. So I think if you come prepared, having read the materials, you're familiar with what we're doing, we don't need to do a whole lot of overview of background, then that will be hugely helpful to the group getting some good work done.
Excellent. And then the last comment was from Jack. He was asking if there are other national marine sanctuaries that have done this already, and whether or not there might be adaptation options we can pull from them. And I can partially answer this in that some of the resources that I've sourced on our strategies table, those can definitely be used. But as far as other national marine sanctuaries, I'm not sure whether anyone else has pioneered in this area yet.
No one else has done a kind of effort of this scale. There's been some climate work out of Olympic Coast to kind of characterize the region and how the region may look with climate impacts. But as far as a project of this scale, we're definitely the first to do this. And as a side note, we are working with headquarters to try to extend what we're doing out to other sanctuary sites and to provide the resources and the information to other sites to hopefully do a similar effort. But yes, as Whitney mentioned, her table provides plenty of examples of this type of work that has been applied to coastal and marine areas. But as far as a sanctuary-run program, this is definitely the first of its kind.
The one document that I can offer that might have some value is the Climate Change Action Plan that came out of the Florida Keys. It's actually called the Climate Change Action Plan for the Florida Reef System, that actually just had a review of how much of it had been completed. And we can post, I'm pretty certain we have an electronic copy of that we could post up on the workshop support page, the project support page, It's short and sweet, which is nice. The only other tool that I think might be useful, but it might also be totally over the top, is that the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority did a very large endeavor along these lines.
Okay.
I think they had a 500-page report. No one wants to read that.
Yeah, maybe let's not even go there. The Florida Reef Tract one sounds really useful though, and so yeah, we'll add that under the supplemental readings on the webpage if anyone's interested. Is that all the questions, Whitney?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And you guys can talk to us too if you prefer that method. But I know as questions come to you, it's easy to write it down. So looking at the agenda, we'll have Anne welcome the group, and since we do have quite a few new members and membership has changed, we do want for everyone to kind of introduce themselves so that everyone can know who all is at the table. I'll review the agenda, very brief review again of kind of the resources for you to use throughout the day. I don't know that if John will be doing this, it might end up being Sam, or maybe even one of our working group volunteers will want to step up. We had a few members of the working group volunteer to help with the scenario summaries. But I would like a brief presentation on those scenarios because you will be developing recommendations under each scenario. I think it will be really important to have a refresher and for that person to actually focus on the habitat level impacts under each scenario so that you're going into this understanding, okay, our outer coast estuaries for scenario 1, these were the major impacts that were discussed. And that information is available in the scenario summaries, but I think it will be good to have that refresher the day of. Then Whitney and I decided that Laura will be doing a very brief adaptation jumpstart. I don't know what that would entail, but I know it would be great because Laura is awesome at this. And so Laura, you'll be doing that at the beginning of the day as well. And then we'll take a break, and then really the real work begins. And we've allocated pretty much an hour for each scenario. And I think the first scenario will probably take the longest because it will be the first time that you're working with this group of people, the first time you're developing management recommendations for this habitat in this context. And so I think we don't have to stick strictly to that 1 hour per scenario, but that's kind of the general amount of time because we'll have overall 4 hours for you to develop management recommendations for those scenarios. And this agenda can be changed. This is kind of my first pass at it. I've had review from a few other folks, but if you feel like it's just not enough time or there's a different way you want to organize it, then certainly feel free to chime in or type your comments to Whitney and we can further discuss that. Once the groups have developed those recommendations for all 4 scenarios for their habitat, the idea then is to stay in your habitat groups and kind of look across those recommendations for the 4 scenarios and start to identify some common strategies across those scenarios. Then during report out, that's what we would want to hear from you. We don't want to just hear each group kind of list out all the strategies, but maybe for the groups to kind of pinpoint, highlight, identify those strategies that they felt were more robust or that really rose to the top during their discussion. We'll also have time during that item to just hear from you about how you felt the planning process went. And then for the last 15 minutes, I'll just be discussing with everyone kind of the next steps based on how the planning went that day, what we can expect to come next, if we need another planning meeting or if we're ready in October to actually start prioritizing and finalizing those recommendations. And so that's the plan for September 15th. Are there any questions or comments regarding that day?
There was one question about who we see providing the summaries of the scenarios, if it's just going to be John or if you would introduce other folks to talk about each individual scenario.
So I'm not sure yet. John has been involved in the working group, but he's kind of done his part and is kind of stepping back now as more of the science lead. And so we may have Sam to review those scenarios because he has been kind of the staff person that's been working on those. So I that's kind of up in the air right now, but we'll figure that out soon. And if anybody has ideas of if they'd rather hear from fellow working group participants, the ones that actually help develop those, then we could potentially do that.
Great. That was the only question.
Okay. I did want to just show you the worksheet that you'll be using at your September 15th meeting, just so it's not, brand new when you sit down to work with your group. We have already kind of gone through the structure of the recommendations and all the little components that we want, so this shouldn't be too new, but this is just how I plan on organizing it for you. I'm trying to make it as easy as possible. This is actually the for the beaches, dunes, and cliffs group, but I'll develop a worksheet for each habitat group, and I'm personalizing them because I want to have your management goals on this worksheet so that you're actually developing recommendations specifically to accomplish that goal. That's why we spent time over the summer on the phone with all of you to develop these goals, because we really want that to serve as the framework for you. Up here in this box, I thought it would be helpful for each scenario for you to have a place to jot down from the summaries, from the presentation in the morning, the major impacts expected for your habitat under that scenario. So you kind of have this reference point up here. You have your management goal reference point right here on the worksheet to help frame and guide your discussion. And then, as I mentioned earlier, kind of the overall approach and rationale for that approach. And then within that approach, multiple possibly strategic actions. You may just have one, you may have more than 4. And then these are all the pieces of information that we would want you to include for each of those actions, the same pieces of information that I reviewed earlier. And so you'll see the beaches, dunes, and cliffs group have one goal up here to maintain functional stability and protect and enhance the ecological integrity of the beach and dune environment. And then we've got space for them to develop those actions. And then their second goal was to protect existing cliff habitat. And so then they have space there to develop recommendations for that goal. And then at the bottom is just descriptors for each of those categories, just in case it's, you forget what I mean by spatial or site-specific, just some extra information there. So this will be, the primary thing you'll be working off of during those 4 hours of planning on September 15th. Let's see, so we've gone through these 4 major resources at the top here. Here's kind of an overview of the schedule. And then to get into the actual required readings. So the climate scenarios are actually still kind of in development. It's been a challenge to really finish and tighten those up. Sam from Point Blue Conservation Science will be joining us at 3, and he's going to go over the scenarios at that time. And so in the meantime, I'll introduce kind of the other resources, and we don't need to spend a lot of time on these. I just want you to see where they are, to be familiar with what they are, and to also have an opportunity to provide any feedback or questions on each of these. And so underneath the scenarios, the very next document you'll see are the management goals that have been developed by you for your habitat. And I decided to just put them all in one document. It may be helpful for you to see what the other habitat goals are, and it's just less, PDFs to try to look for. So we have the management goals for beaches, dunes, and cliffs, and they actually also identified potential actions under each goal. So they've kind of jump-started a little bit on their adaptation planning. 3 goals for the outer coast estuaries, and 3 goals for the Rocky Intertidal, and in a couple situations they also developed some more specific actions. And so that is there for your review. Of course, it'd be good to be familiar with your own habitat management goals. The next resource that you should definitely be familiar with for your habitat, you certainly don't need to read the assessments for the other habitats because that would take a little bit of time. But these are the vulnerability assessments that we developed through our assessment process, and these are all in the report that was just released in June of this year. But here's the beaches and dunes one. Each one is like 8 to 10 pages, but it really details all the input we got from our assessment participants as well as information from the literature. Gives you an idea of the relative vulnerability to compare with other habitats and with other resources that were assessed. And it's broken down into the 3 major components of vulnerability: sensitivity, and it lists the major climate impacts that the habitat is sensitive to. And then adaptive capacity, and this provides some information on kind of the extent of the habitat, the ability of the habitat to deal with disturbance and with stressors, resistance and recovery, diversity within the habitat. And then management potential, and this is some potentially useful information down here, the description of potential management options. This is kind of just the very basic brainstorming ideas from the assessment participants after assessing the vulnerability of this habitat. These were some of the ideas they had for what management could do to reduce that vulnerability. So this might be nice for you to review. And then finally, exposure, which is pretty straightforward, and then all the literature. So this will be a great resource for your planning group to be familiar with for your particular habitat. And then next we have, I'm going to turn it to Whitney, because she has put together this really fantastic resource that I've mentioned a couple times. And this is the strategies table that, as Jack asked, has a whole bunch of examples from marine and coastal environments of actions that other agencies or groups have taken nationwide. There's some very specific to our area, and can really be used as a springboard for your planning efforts. And so, Whitney, do you want to spend a few minutes talking through this table and how you hope it can be used by the working group?
Sure. So this is essentially an improved version of the table that you guys saw at our May meeting. So I've added a first page here which kind of goes over the terminology that's used throughout the table. And at the bottom of the page, there's also definitions for the different adaptation options that we discussed at our meeting. So these are just different categories to consider as you're thinking through what sort of actions you want to develop for your own habitat. And just try to keep in mind that resilient management really requires implementing a variety of adaptation options. You never want to have all of your eggs in the same basket, so really focus on trying to develop strategies and actions that fall within these different categories. So as you move on to the second and subsequent pages, Sarah, if you could scroll down, that'd be great. What we have is a fairly built out table. And this table has a couple different components that I'll go over really quickly. So on the left, we have our overall goal, which is those 5 different categories: enhancing resistance, promoting resilience, facilitating transition, increasing knowledge, or enhancing coordination. And within each goal, we have different strategies and specific actions that have been identified from different literature sources as far as what folks are doing in order to address different vulnerabilities. So what you'll be doing is a very similar approach, is developing a specific strategy or goal that you want to accomplish, and then listing very specific actions that can be used to undertake or to meet that goal or to accomplish that strategy. And then on the right-hand side, or in the right-hand column, there are different examples and case studies. And so we've designed this to both be usable online and offline. So you can click through the current case study that's listed. They're all hyperlinked, and that will take you largely to the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange, where there are pretty extensive case studies. So you can learn more about the particular examples that you find really relevant or really interesting. But we've also given a brief description so that if you want to bring a hard copy with you to the workshop, in case you don't have Wi-Fi access, you'll have an idea of what these different groups have been doing or how these actions or examples are linked with the action that they represent. So I just encourage you to take a look through this table and to get some ideas of what folks are doing, but then also to think about how that can be adapted or applied to your specific area, because it will require some fine-tuning for your area. Anything else you can think of, Sarah, to add for this?
No, I think you covered it. Sorry, I was muted. Thank you, Whitney. And were there any questions on that?
So far, I'm not seeing any pop-up.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. And also, just to tag on to this, if there are specific strategies or actions that you have thought of that you don't see represented here, I encourage you to hop over to the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange, or cakex.org website, and you can actually search your specific idea. And there's tons of case studies on there that aren't represented here. So this is just a sampling from coastal marine areas or terrestrial areas that are particularly relevant, or ideas that are relevant to our area. So I encourage you to explore further.
And it's incredibly exhaustive, and I think will really be very, very helpful, not just to this working group, but I think this is a resource that should be shared much more widely with other groups, because I think it could be a really, really great resource for other folks. So Whitney, I can't thank you enough for your work on this. It's like really amazing. And I hope that you all will give some time to this table and really study it in advance of the September meeting. Okay, so we've gone through most of the required readings. You know, this was something that we were discussing with you know, our project planning team. Initially, we were going to put together a list of like all the management plans for all the different agencies that have, you know, jurisdiction in the study region, and we realized that was kind of ridiculous. And you know, the point of each of you being on this working group is to represent your agency and to come to this meeting with your, you know, management goals for your particular agency in mind to help apply to this effort. And because this is a working group of the Advisory Council for the Sanctuary, we don't actually have any sanctuary staff on the working group. And so we felt like it would be helpful if you're familiar with the Sanctuary's management plan, because we hope that some of these recommendations will be applicable and implemented by sanctuary management. And so that's why we included kind of our management plan here as a required reading. And then Sam will be joining us very shortly, which is great because I want us to spend some time on those climate scenarios. But it should be great timing because I only need a couple more minutes. I did want to show you these maps that we had put together by Tim Reed, who is our GIS specialist here at the Sanctuary. We had discussed these maps at previous meetings as a potential resource when you're developing these strategies to have, you know, that spatial detail and to be able to look at a certain area and to see, okay, is this, you know, in the sanctuary, is this also covered by a national park, a state park, you know, who has jurisdiction in this area? And I should have pulled this up earlier because it's going to take a little bit to load, unfortunately. But what Tim has done is he's developed maps, one for Marin County, one for San Mateo County, which also includes San Francisco County in it, and one for Sonoma County. And so it's basically taking the study region of North Central California and just splitting it up into 3 maps because it is such a huge region. And we just did that by county lines because it was kind of an easy way to do that. And then he also, because we felt there were a few areas that were going to need some more detailed attention, he also produced maps for, with more detail for Bolinas Lagoon, Russian River, and Tamales Bay. And one of the things I wanted to pose to this group is if you felt there was another geographic region in the study area that would be really useful to have a more detail level map for. And then also just to get your feedback in general on these county maps, if it would ever pull up. Here we go. And so here, this is an example. This is the map for Marin County, and this one is actually the one that includes San Francisco County as well. But you can see he's denoted here national park lands, California state parks, California Fish and Wildlife, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and then the National Marine Sanctuaries boundaries are here as well as what are termed the wildlife protection zones, which are most often related to seabird protection areas. And so this gives you a sense when you are developing recommendations who the major players might be, and kind of what's going on in that region. And if I'm able, I'll pull up the more detailed level for Bolinas Lagoon. But right off the bat, I don't know if anyone has any ideas or recommendations. I know Daphne had already responded to me after seeing these with some saying that National Park Service did have some updated layers that we could use, because I think what we have on here is maybe outdated for NPS. And so we will update with that. But if there's any other feedback on these maps, we are wanting to just continually keep them updated just based on feedback. We will probably be able to produce another set before the September 15th meeting. And then after that, based on your recommendations, we could even produce another set in advance of your October meeting if it's something that would be helpful.
This is Jim. I was wondering, were you planning to have maps of the southern Mendocino County?
So I think the Sonoma County map covers that very southern portion of Mendocino, because it goes right up to our study area boundaries, which is Alder Creek in Mendocino County. So it's a very small portion of Mendocino, but it is included on the Sonoma map. Yeah.
Okay. And I can send you updated BLM ownership information as well.
Oh, perfect. Okay. Yeah, and if it's just like a GIS layer, then he can just use that. I'm not a map making person, but I know that.
Yeah, it'll be GIS information.
Okay, yes, perfect. Okay, and so here's kind of a more detailed example of what Tim could produce if we have any additional areas that we would like. This is for Bolinas Lagoon, and this is really cool because there's you kind of tell what the ground cover is like, and it just has a little more detail. If you're producing recommendations for Bolinas Lagoon, then this would be really helpful. So if there aren't, any comments on that now, then definitely, look at these on the website. They're here under the reading and resources, under adaptation planning maps. If something comes to mind, or if you feel like there's an additional resource that you think would be helpful to your planning group, then certainly let me know, and we'll try to have it produced in time for the meeting.
This is Marion Finley in San Mateo County Parks. I think a map of Pillar Point, Half Moon Bay, up to Fitzgerald Marine Reserve would be really important for the Rocky and the Tidal group.
Okay, you're a little muffled, but I heard you say Fitzgerald, and you said Half Moon Bay?
And Pillar Point.
And what point?
Pillar
Point. So, okay, so are you talking about the harbors specifically?
The harbor and beyond.
Okay.
And at the county level.
Right, yeah, because those are in the county level. Okay. So kind of zoomed in maps for those. Tiller Point, Half Moon Bay, and Fitzgerald. Okay.
Thanks.
And we have two people who have their hands raised. Kate, is there something you want to say? Okay, how about Marlene?
No, I just did.
Excellent, then I'm going to put your hands down. And Kate also is happy as a clam.
She says yes, happy as a clam. And there's also a comment that the map for Pescadero Marsh would be a good addition.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the zoomed in are more.
Yeah, they're really, the zoomed in are pretty useful. Okay. Yeah, and so, I'll send these requests to Tim and see if he can produce these in time for the September meeting.
Sarah,
Any other? Oh, sorry. Hey, Ann.
Hey, can you clarify too, we're just talking about the outer coast and not interior to San Francisco Bay, is that correct?
Yes, yes.
Okay,
Just,
okay.
yeah, just planning for the outer coast. Yeah, and
including like Savannah.
right. Yeah, including the outer coast estuaries, which do go inland. But I think she was asking about San Francisco Bay.
Yeah, the San Mateo one, you know, has land status inside the bay, but not everything.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Great. Okay. So unless there are any other questions, I think the last thing for us to go over are the climate scenarios, which is actually a very important component. And so I have those pulled up on Google Docs because we don't actually, you know, have those finalized and on the web yet. But I'm hoping that this week we can get those finished up early next week at the latest and have them online for you to review. But again, we will be kind of reviewing the habitat level impacts for all the scenarios at the actual meeting. And so I'm just going to actually click on my email real quick to see if Sam has emailed saying he won't be on. Okay, no. So I'm hoping that Sam.
There's a couple other questions if we want to try to give him a couple minutes.
Yeah, that'd be great. I didn't know we have more questions. Sure, let's do it.
All right, so the first one is any of the information presented in the vulnerability assessment for the habitat site specific? For example, Bolinas, Fitzgerald, et cetera.
There are some, you know, it's very specific to each habitat. There are some comments from participants and some references in those that probably do point out a specific location, but in general, the assessments are operating kind of at a higher level across this entire region for this habitat type, not a specific location.
Great, okay. And then there was another comment about a map that we may want to include is the Garcia River estuary and adjacent reefs at Point Arena.
Okay. I'm writing that down. Garcia River estuary and adjacent reef, and that's at Point Arena.
Yes.
Okay.
And then one other comment, just reiterating that it would be helpful for working group members to come with their agency and organization management goals because the rest of the members may not know what other agencies or entities are prioritizing.
Yes. Yes, that would be very helpful.
Yep, and that is all the questions that we've had thus far, unless anyone else wants to chime in.
Okay. Great. That's really great feedback and questions. So I'm excited to hear that you all are digging this. Okay, so I don't know why Sam is not on, but I can go ahead and kind of start. And I know I see that Andy and Brenna are on. Those are two of our kind of working group volunteers that helped to develop these scenarios. But Debbie and Joel are not on. So we've got two of the four. And so Andy and Brenna, if you guys want to chime in at any point, I'm just going to give a basic overview of the scenarios that John Largier first wrote up and then that you all have been kind of contributing to. And so if you will remember, the main drivers that we decided to focus on were runoff and, man, I wish I could make this bigger without it messing up. But we're runoff and upwelling. And John Largier really kind of detailed out these major drivers. And these are kind of the drivers that frame the four climate scenarios. And so runoff is really considering the impacts of changing precipitation and runoff via rivers and storms, but also wave extremes and strong south winds that are associated with winter storms that bring that precipitation. Upwelling was the other major factor that defines these scenarios. With that factor, we're considering the impacts of changing north winds, which drive upwelling of cold-enriched waters and thus control exposure to low pH, low dissolved oxygen, and high nitrate. Also rough spring and summer seas, colder air temperatures, and fog, which is associated with upwelling. There were two factors that we considered kind of implicit with across all four scenarios that we know are going to be major drivers of change, and they're kind of consistent across the four scenarios, and that is rising sea level, which may be locally mitigated or enhanced by changes in winds, upwelling, and runoff, also combined with waves and winds to account for coastal flooding and erosion. And then, oh, he is, okay, so I hear that Sam's trying to call in right now. And then acidification is that other factor that we're just assuming across the scenarios is going to be a player. And so there we're considering the impacts of increasing carbon dioxide levels, the effects of which may be regionally or locally mitigated or enhanced by changes in upwelling, runoff, and organic nutrient loading of runoff. And so when we put these scenarios together, we'll have kind of this scenario overview document that really goes over the major drivers that kind of frame the four different scenarios. And then also this kind of visual that helps to see how they all interact. But at this point, we can go through kind of each scenario, and we never ended up coming up with kind of jazzy titles, which is a bummer because they're kind of boring titles.
Sarah, I just want to say I just got on.
Hey, Sam! Yay! So, Sam,
sorry,
oh, go ahead.
I was going to apologize. I was telling Kelly I was struggling to call in for my cell and find the access code. I kept dialing the wrong number. So anyway, I apologize for being late.
That's all right. I was just kind of going over like an overview of the major drivers of runoff and upwelling, and also those that are kind of implicit in the scenarios, sea level and acidification. And so if you could kind of walk us through the four different scenarios and kind of how we have developed those and maybe the next steps for getting those finalized, because I'm hoping we can have kind of final scenarios for the group before the September meeting, definitely, so they can understand the habitat impacts from those scenarios.
Yeah, great. Well, maybe you've gone over this, but John Largier really helped us. I think this started from the group's input at our previous meeting, but then John really took what we had started and really grounded these scenarios in more of the state of the science, I would say. And so, he was really able to pull in his knowledge from literature to I think, make these scenarios more plausible than we were able to do in the meetings. So like you said, the main drivers are the sort of, the stronger upwelling or the more or less upwelling and this, runoff scenario. Really, those form the two axes. And so, when we say runoff, we're really thinking about, having the storm, more runoff tends to be in the winter. So you have these bigger storms associated with southern winds and tend to have larger waves associated with them versus not having those. So that's, and with those storms, you obviously get the runoff from the land as well. So that sort of comprises that axis, and then the more or less upwelling. So, Sarah, the plan, we want to walk through each of the scenarios now? Is that kind of the idea? Or did we want to sort of go, the folks working on these did a good job of sort of adding in the management, potential impact, habitat impacts and management recommendations. And so that's another.
And, they are a little detailed and lengthy. And so I think, working group members will just need to be familiar with these and to read through them. And so maybe, for the purposes of this call, we only have 15 minutes left. If we could maybe go over the habitat level impacts of kind of what our working group volunteers added to John's descriptions, and then, what's our plan for finalizing, Sam, and kind of next steps?
No, that's what I think we should do. And so I actually think that the folks did a good job, and I think where we're at is what we need the rest of the group to do is review these and really start focusing in on the impacts and the management recommendations and thinking about where you know, do you buy into what's down here, or do you have some suggested edits and if we can start getting those before the September 15th meeting, I think that's great, so we can sort of make the best use of our time at that meeting. So with this first scenario, looking into, when I say first, the cold and dry, so that's weaker runoff with drier winters and then stronger upwelling with colder summers, the habitat impacts that were identified for the dunes and beaches were, you know, reduced tourism in the summer because of it's colder. That could lead to economic impacts, but you might have drier, milder conditions in the spring, so it could be, you know, a shifting of the real tourist season on the coast. You know, so the timing of tourism might change, and could be implications there. There could be erosion of north-facing beaches, but also at the same time growth of south-facing beaches. And then noted, you know, much of the study area is actually south-facing, so that could be really important. And so you could get beach growth in those areas, but erosion on the north-facing. Dune wetlands could suffer because you got the reduced rain, reduced blowouts. In north-facing dune systems might suffer the increased erosion as the beaches themselves. The rough summer conditions, you know, could provide hazards to people use for recreation. Ab divers, kayakers, for example. Fishermen might be another good example. So management recommendations: work with local communities to promote tourism, recreation in early spring, and increase education and access management efforts, for example, to protect snipe plovers in the breeding season. Needing to manage public access in places where beaches are eroding, and possibly directing them to the beaches, the more south-facing beaches that could be growing. But it, depending on the demand, if people aren't going because of the cold summers, maybe it's less of an issue. You might want to consider sediment enhancement for dune systems, specifically the north-facing dune systems. Increased monitoring of the dune wetlands and the wetland-dependent species. Increasing removal of the European beach grass to promote dune mobility and dynamic dune wetlands. And increased safety and education and coordination with the Coast Guard. And so moving on to estuarine, you could have potential severe impacts to some monids because of the closures of creek mouths and reduced nearshore productivity. But the reduced winter storms could be beneficial because you have fewer juveniles being washed out early. So there could be a trade-off there. The increased OA could in fact impact invertebrate populations, oyster growers, crab fishers, and other key species at the base of the food web. And the reduced sediment transport from coastal watersheds could impact the mudflats. So let's see, management recommendations: increased monitoring of some monids, possibly actively breaching river mouths to allow fish passage and mitigate hypoxia if it becomes necessary, and monitoring of benthic invertebrates and shellfish, and working with shellfish growers and crab fishermen to make sure there's healthy populations. Rocky intertidal, the increased OA could impact many invertebrate populations, oyster growers, crab fisheries, and other key species at the base of the food web. And the rough summer conditions could increase emergency rescues of recreational divers. So management implications: increased monitoring of benthic invertebrates, shellfish and crabs, increased safety education. So there's some overlap, especially with the other habitats under that scenario. So how was that? Do we want to go through the other three? I actually thought that particularly this scenario, did a good job of coming up with management recommendations. I noticed In the other scenarios, there was a lot of recommendations for monitoring, but I guess I think to really make the exercise useful, I think we need to come up with some, like they did in this scenario, more active management in addition to the monitoring, to really, give people a sense of what you would actually do given those conditions. So I think this first one, though, is a really good example to start with. So Sarah, what do you think? Do we want to keep going through the rest of them, or is it?
Yeah, I don't know that we necessarily have the time to do that.
Yeah.
I think if we can task the working group very specifically with maybe what we want to happen before September 15th, that might be more useful, and then ask them to either read through these on their own or provide feedback on their own. I can share these Google Docs with the entire working group, and people can comment on them.
So that would be my suggestion, is that we open up the Google Docs and let people sort of respond to, and I would focus in, because I think we feel pretty good about the scenarios themselves. I mean, if somebody wants to comment on those,
right.
But I feel like
at
at
the
this
description
point,
at the top.
Yeah, but the habitat impacts in management, I think, is, we're more moving into that realm, and so if people can start responding to what to what we have down, and if somebody doesn't agree with an impact, they can leave a comment, but you could also put in, are there some additional impacts that were left out, and what are some management solutions that we want to put on the table. I think that would be what we need the working groups to do before the meeting.
Okay, and I would just say, so I'll share these scenarios with everyone on the working group. I'll ask you all, to access them and read through them, leave comments if you have comments to leave. And so we're looking at, 2 weeks. And so I would just say by next Friday, so that Monday I could maybe package these up in time for Tuesday's meeting, or because we need the calendar. We need the calendar. So I would say by Friday the 12th, so that then I could kind of clean them up, have them final for Tuesday's meeting. Does that sound reasonable to folks, to try to take a look at those, at the very least to become familiar with the general ideas and habitat impacts, and maybe contribute a little bit to those? Okay, I'm not here.
Affirmative.
One affirmative. Awesome.
And so one additional criteria I think people should respond to is, on the working group website, there is the goals, sort of the management goals that are there, and I would, definitely look at them with that lens. But we might also want to consider, especially if you're representing another agency within the study area, what are the management goals of your agency, or so we really look at these impacts and management recommendations with those goals in mind. You want to manage to those goals, but then also, are the goals going to be relevant in each of these scenarios? So.
Which is the same question we talked about earlier with the adaptation planning. So.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So with that, I really think that the next steps in the 2 weeks before our meeting on the 15th is to really review those required readings, to become familiar with the process and what we'll be doing actually at the meeting on the 15th, and then to really look into these scenarios, which I'll share with you all. And if anyone has trouble accessing Google Docs, I know, some people just, their email servers have a really hard time, or if they don't have Gmail, it can be difficult. So, I can just send them around. I can have them attached to the email just in case you need those. But on Google Docs, it's nice because you can make comments that everyone else can see. And so those would be the next steps. And then, in the meantime, feel free to contact any of us on the planning team, Laura and Whitney with EcoAdapt, Sam at Point Blue, myself at the Sanctuary. All of our emails are on that participant list on your working group webpage with any questions or ideas. And like I said, we're going to try to update the maps and the resources to be most useful at the meeting. So please get me any comments as soon as possible so that we can really make this as effective as possible. And so I think that's it. Anybody else on the planning team have some final thoughts? And if you're still on, any thoughts from you, or we can go ahead and end it.
This is Anne. I'm still on, but no parting thoughts, but look forward to continued engagement and seeing hopefully most everyone on September 15th.
Yep. Okay. So, yeah, thanks everybody for participating, and Anne, thank you for your leadership with this group. And I really look forward to seeing everyone again on September 15th, and I will send out more details about the meeting, especially for those of you that have not met at that building yet. But we are in the same building, so that's nice. Okay, so I hope you all have a great week, and of course contact me if you have any questions, and thanks for tuning in.
Thanks everyone.